So I decided to shoot this little video as kind of a step back memory-wise. I'm going to kind of ride around our old neighborhood in Coon Rapids, go by the elementary schools. But at first I thought the best place for it to start out would be our old house right there at 11324 Bittersweet Street. You can see that they've paved the driveway, they've got a different paint job, they've got a garage, which was something I always wished we had back then. We used to play baseball all the time sitting out here in the middle of the street here. The Hansons were right next door. I don't remember the the people that lived across the street right here. Of course, we had the Hardys lived right here in this house. This was where we always hung out. There was kids in every house. I remember this house that is right in front of us here. This little kid by the name of Pee Wee lived there. And the big story about him was that his mom got mad at him one day, and she threw a fork at him and stuck it right in his forehead. I guess nobody was outraged at that time, but nowadays, of course, he would have been thrown in jail. We'll take a drive down South Heights Drive. We used to know pretty much there were kids in all of these houses. Can't remember much for names anymore, but this was my paper route. This was where I started it. I can remember my first house was 2601. That was where my paper route actually started. Interesting that after all these years I would remember that. So we moved into that house on Bittersweet Street in 1959. My parents had it built. I believe, if I recall correctly, they paid $14,900 for it. We were one of the first houses in this Thompson edition. I remember when they were building all these other houses, they used to have huge piles of dirt and earth-moving equipment and bulldozers, and geez, that was fun for a kid to play on. We'd climb up and down those dirt mounds, which they were probably 2 stories high. They were pretty tall to a 8-year-old kid, and we'd have rock fights. And I can remember one time I pegged this kid, I can't even remember his name anymore. He was at the bottom throwing rocks up at me. I was at the top throwing rocks down. I think there were several of them down there. Well, I got him right in the middle of the forehead, opened him up pretty good. And I was scared. I knew I was going to get punished. And so I decided to be proactive, and I went home and I knocked on my parents' bedroom. I think it was still early in the morning on a weekend, and they were still sleeping. I said, remember how you told me that I wouldn't get in trouble if I came to you and told you something I did bad and I admitted to it? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, I just threw a rock and I hit a little kid in the forehead and he's bleeding all over the place. And well, guess what? They lied. I got in big trouble. So this is Hoover Elementary School. I never went here. Christy, Wendy, and Sue, I think, went here. But I remember that they had to walk to school, and it was a pretty long distance for them. Once again, this was all these houses were on my paper route. I remember that paper route vividly. I remember mostly on Sundays in the wintertime where we had to pull that big cart through the snow. And of course, as I remember back, it was at least 5 feet of snow, and the temperatures were, they must have been hovering around 100 degrees below zero. Winds were, 80, 90 miles an hour. It was terrible. But the worst part was trying to come and collect from people. They would, you could walk up to their house in the middle of the wintertime. Oh, and right up ahead here is the Seawards. Keith was one of my best friends. and Carol was one of Sue's best friends. But the worst part about that collecting on the paper route was you could walk by the windows and see them in the living room, and you go knock on their door and they wouldn't answer it. They would peek out the window, they see it was you collecting your measly $1.25 or whatever it was for the paper route, and they wouldn't answer the door. They'd make you come back time after time. And they'd also do whatever they could to screw you out of a dime. They'd confuse you with numbers, and finally you'd walk out of there and end up paying for it on what you got to keep from your collection money, and you'd be at least 10 cents short. So right in front of me is a park that we used to come and play in. Geez, back then it seemed like it was huge. We used to play baseball down here. It seemed like we could go forever and almost get lost in it. And now it's so puny. It's funny how that works. I'll go back up South Heights Drive now. Yeah, I knew a lot of the kids in these houses. I think Mike Howard lived in that house. He played on the Tigers Little League team with me. There weren't nearly so many kids or trees in the yards back then. And I'll drive up Arrowhead here. And one thing I noticed pretty drastically is that there are no kids. I see 0 kids out. There were kids in every one of these houses back then in the early '60s. Big baby boomer age. The houses, I guess, were affordable back then for people that were raising families. And kids were all over the place, playing baseball out in the street. Never saw soccer. That didn't exist for us back then. So I'll drive down Bittersweet once again to our past our house. So this little cul-de-sac here was a place where we played a lot of baseball games. The Masdens live in that house right there. Jan was a couple of years older than me. I heard he died young. But we used to play, the home plate was right here. And left field was up in that yard right there. Right field was over in that yard right there. And I can remember one time, it's funny that we never broke any windows, but we used these balls that were, baseballs that were covered with this real bouncy rubber, and boy, you could really smack that thing. And if it got out into on the other side of Bittersweet over there, it would roll forever. Now, of course, that was a home run. I can remember one time, the kid that lived a couple doors down on the other side of Bittersweet, Donnie something or another, his dad came over and he was going to show us how to play catcher. We had a kid by the name of Mike Smith back then he was a couple years older than us. He was playing in Little League. He could really throw a fastball, it seemed to us anyway. And so Donnie's dad got down and played catcher and was showing us how to do it. And Mike threw a pitch and it bounced off the tar and right into Donnie's dad's crotch, laid him out. Like unbelievably, laid him out flat. He threw up, He said the only thing he could said was, "Donnie, go get your mother. Donnie, go get your mother." And they hauled him away in the car. Solidays lived here. Carpenters lived here. Hathaways lived here. Their kid had some really neat old cars back then. This was Schnelly's, I think their name was. And we couldn't go in their yard. They'd call the police on us. They were awful. I can't remember the people's name that lived in this house, but the kid's name was Doug. He was a couple years behind me. Well, actually, probably 5 years or more behind me, but I guess he turned out to be a pretty darn good football player.